My husband brought his mistress to my mother's funeral. He held her hand at the back of the church while I stood alone at the casket, burying the only person who had ever truly loved me. People whispered. Some looked away out of pity. Others stared like I was the one who'd done something wrong. What he didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, my mother had signed something into my name. Something he had no idea even existed. He thought he was humiliating me in front of everyone we knew. He had no idea he was about to lose every single thing he loved. Before I tell you how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe karma doesn't need help, it just needs patience. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and for the last 11 years, I worked as a hospital administrator while my husband, Daniel, ran what he called a consulting business out of our home office. I use that term loosely now because looking back, I'm not sure he consulted on anything except how to spend my paycheck. We met young. I was 24, fresh into my career, and Daniel was charming in a way that made you forget to ask questions. He had big plans, a business that would take off any year now. I believed him. I believed him for over a decade. My mother, Eleanor, never liked him. She was quiet about it, the way Southern women often are, a tight smile here, a pointed silence there. She never said, "I told you so," not once, even when his business failed for the 3rd time, and I quietly covered the mortgage payments he claimed he'd handle next month. My mother was the one constant in my life. She lived 2 hours away, in the house I grew up in, and every Sunday I drove out to see her. Daniel rarely came. He always had a reason, a client call, a headache, a golf thing with men whose names I never quite remembered. I made excuses for him so often that making excuses started to feel like part of my personality. Then, 8 months ago, my mother was the one constant in my life. She lived 2 hours away, in the house I grew up in, and every Sunday I drove out to see her. Daniel rarely came. He always had a reason, a client call, a headache, a golf thing with men whose names I never quite remembered. I made excuses for him so often that making excuses started to feel like part of my personality. Then, 8 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I won't pretend that period wasn't the hardest of my life. I drove out every weekend, sometimes midweek too, sitting with her through chemo, through the bad days, through the moments she'd squeeze my hand and tell me she just wanted to see me happy before she went. I didn't tell her things weren't right at home. I didn't want her last months filled with worry about a marriage she'd never trusted in the first place. Daniel, during all of this, became harder to reach. Later trips for business. Later nights. A new cologne I didn't recognize. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I told myself a lot of things that month. My mother passed in March. Quietly, in her sleep, the way she always said she hoped to go. I was there. Daniel was not. He'd left 2 days earlier for an investor meeting in Charlotte. He came back the morning of the funeral, freshly shaved, smelling like that same unfamiliar cologne, and told me he was so sorry for my loss, like he was reading it off a card. I should have known something was wrong long before the funeral. But grief has a way of making you accept whatever scraps of normalcy someone hands you, just so the day feels survivable. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my mother had made one final decision before she died. A decision she made without telling me, because she said she didn't want me to fight her on it. A decision that would matter more than anyone in that church could have imagined, including me. I just didn't know it yet. The funeral was set for a Saturday morning at the small church my mother had attended for 30 years. I'd barely slept the night before, going over the service details, the flowers, the photos for the memorial table, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind quiet. Daniel said he'd drive separately because he had one more call to take care of beforehand. I didn't argue. By that point in our marriage, I'd stopped expecting him to show up the way a husband should, and started just being grateful when he showed up at all. I got to the church early. My Aunt Pamela was already there, along with a handful of my mother's old friends from her book club, her neighbor of 20 years, and a few cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas. The casket was already in place. White roses, just like she'd asked for. I remember standing there thinking, this is real now, in a way it hadn't felt real until that exact moment. Daniel arrived 15 minutes late. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him was maybe 30. Dressed in a black dress that was a little too fitted for a funeral, her hand resting on his arm like she belonged there. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought she might be a coworker, someone from his office who'd come to support him. Then I saw the way he leaned toward her, the way she straightened his tie before they walked in. The way neither of them let go of each other's hand. Even as they passed my mother's casket. My and Pamela grabbed my wrist so hard it left a mark. "Claire," she whispered. "Who is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. I just stood there, in my black dress, at my mother's funeral, watching my husband walk and holding another woman's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had the audacity to come over and hug me. "I'm so sorry, Claire," he said, like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't just watched him walk through the doors of my mother's funeral with his arm around someone else. "Who is she, Daniel?" I asked quietly, because I refused to make a scene in that church, no matter how badly I wanted to. "That's Brianna. She's been helping me with the business. She insisted on coming today for support." He said it so smoothly, so rehearsed, that for one humiliating second I almost believed him, almost, because I saw her hand on his lower back when he turned away from me. I saw the way she looked at him, not like a business associate, but like a woman who'd already claimed something that wasn't hers to claim. I got through the service somehow. I don't remember most of the eulogy I gave. I remember my voice shaking, and I remember looking up once and seeing Brianna dab at her eyes with a tissue, performing grief for a woman she'd never met, while sitting 2 rows behind my husband like she had every right to be there, after the service. People came up to offer condolences, and more than one of them glanced toward Daniel and Brianna with a look I recognized instantly, pity, mixed with the unmistakable expression of people who already knew something I didn't. My cousin Megan pulled me aside near the parking lot. "Claire," she said carefully, "how long has Daniel been seeing her?" "What do you mean, seeing her?" My stomach dropped before she even answered. Megan looked like she regretted opening her mouth. "I follow her on Instagram." I didn't put it together until just now, seeing them together. She posts pictures, sometimes restaurants, trips. I thought they were just friends from work, but Claire, there's a picture from 2 months ago, Aspen. They're wearing matching ski jackets. 2 months ago. Daniel had told me he was in Denver for a supplier conference. I didn't cry in that parking lot. I didn't scream. Something in me had already started shutting one door and quietly opening another, the door my mother, in her final weeks, had apparently been working on without me even realizing it. That night, after the funeral, after Daniel came home smelling like Brianna's perfume and offered some half-hearted explanation about her being emotionally supportive during a hard time for him too, I sat alone in my car in our driveway for almost an hour. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet. Not really. I was thinking about my mother and the quiet way she used to say, "Claire, you deserve someone who shows up." I had no idea how literally that sentence was about to come true. The week after the funeral, I tried to convince myself there might be an explanation. Not because I believed it, but because 11 years of marriage doesn't just dissolve in your mind overnight, even when every piece of evidence is staring you in the face. I wanted, just for a few days, to live in the version of my life where my husband hadn't humiliated me in front of everyone who'd ever loved my mother. That version didn't exist. I just hadn't accepted it yet. I started looking. Quietly. I told myself I was just checking, the way you tell yourself a lot of things when you're not ready to know the truth. I found Brianna's Instagram easily. Megan was right. There were photos going back almost a year. Dinners. A weekend in Savannah. The Aspen trip, with the matching jackets, captioned with a single champagne glass emoji. But it was the bank statements that broke something in me. I'd always handled our finances. Daniel said numbers stressed him out, so I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the credit cards. What I didn't know was that he'd opened a second account 8 months earlier. I found the paper statement by accident, shoved behind a filing cabinet in his office. The same week, he claimed he'd been too overwhelmed with work to help me plan my mother's service. $11,000 moved into that account over 6 months. Withdrawals at a jewelry store in Buckhead. A 4-night hotel stay in Charleston. The same week, he told me he was at a supplier conference in Denver. A payment to an apartment leasing company I didn't recognize. I called the leasing office the next morning, pretending to be a prospective tenant asking about a unit number I'd found on the statement. The woman on the phone confirmed it casually, the way people do when they don't know they're handing you the final piece of your own life falling apart. That unit's currently leased to a Daniel and Brianna Whitfield. Whitfield. My last name. He'd put her down using my last name on an apartment lease, like she was already his wife. I sat on the kitchen floor after that call. Not crying, past crying, in that strange numb place where your body just goes quiet because it doesn't know what else to do. My mother had been gone 12 days. My husband had a second apartment with another woman using my name like it was something he could just hand off to whoever was convenient. That night, Daniel came home and acted like nothing in the world was wrong. He asked what was for dinner. He told me about a promising new client he was meeting with that week. He sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table my mother used to sit at every Sunday, and lied to my face without even blinking. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because something else had been sitting in my mind since the funeral, something my mother's lawyer had mentioned briefly at the burial, almost in passing, that I hadn't had the bandwidth to process at the time. Claire, when you're ready. We need to go over the final paperwork your mother signed before she passed. There are some things you'll need to know. I'd assumed it was just standard estate stuff. A will. Maybe some life insurance. I called him the next morning and asked if I could come in early. I had no idea, sitting in that lawyer's waiting room 2 days later, that I was about to learn my mother had quietly handed me something that would change everything. Not just for me, but for Daniel. In ways he couldn't have imagined as he sat in our house, planning his next weekend with a woman wearing my last name. The lowest point of my life was about to become the beginning of the only plan that mattered. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish, the kind of place that had probably seen 1,000 families fall apart quietly across that same mahogany desk. Mr. Harmon had been my mother's attorney for almost 15 years. He'd handled her small business years ago. Then later, after she sold it, he'd helped her manage what she always called the boring stuff, investments, property. Paperwork she didn't trust anyone else to read closely. He slid a folder across the desk and folded his hands. Your mother came to see me 4 months ago, he said. Right after her diagnosis. She made some changes to her estate. She asked me not to discuss any of it with you until after the funeral. She said you'd have enough on your plate. I opened the folder slowly, half expecting some sentimental letter, maybe a modest inheritance, jewelry, the house I grew up in. What I found instead made me go very still. My mother hadn't just left me money. 11 years ago, when she sold her small business, she'd quietly invested in something Daniel had pitched to her back when he was still trying to convince anyone who'd listen that his consulting company was about to take off. She never told me she'd put money into it. She never told him the terms either, not really, because Daniel had been too eager for the check to read the fine print she'd insisted on. She'd structured it as a private loan secured against equity in his business, equity that, 4 months ago, with his company drowning in debt he'd never admitted to me, he'd signed over to her in exchange for the loan being forgiven. He thought he was getting out of a financial hole quietly, without me ever knowing how bad things had really gotten. He had no idea my mother had just become the majority stakeholder in his own company, and now that majority stake belonged to me. There was more. The house Daniel and I lived in, the one I'd assumed was jointly owned, had actually been purchased 9 years ago with a substantial down payment from my mother, structured as a private agreement between her and me alone, with my name as sole owner on a secondary deed Daniel had never bothered to ask about because he'd never once handled our paperwork. He just assumed. The way he assumed a lot of things about me. I sat in that office for almost an hour, reading documents I didn't fully understand at first, while Mr. Harmon patiently explained, line by line, exactly what my mother had built, quietly, deliberately, without a single conversation with the man who thought he was untouchable. She knew, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She knew about Brianna. Mr. Harmon nodded slowly. She suspected something for a while. She didn't have proof. But she told me once, and I'll never forget this, she said, "I'm not going to leave my daughter defenseless. Whatever happens, she needs to be the one holding the cards." I drove home that day in a kind of silence I'd never experienced before. Not grief, not anger, something colder and more focused than either. I didn't tell Daniel anything. I didn't change my routine. I still cooked dinner. I still asked about his day. I let him keep living in the fantasy, where he had an apartment in my name, a girlfriend wearing my last name, and a business he thought was entirely his. Over the next several weeks, I quietly met with Mr. Harmon twice more. I gathered the bank statements, the lease agreement, screenshots from Brianna's Instagram, timestamped against Daniel's supposed business trips. I opened a private account no one knew about and began documenting everything. The way you'd build a case, not out of vengeance, but out of the kind of clarity that only comes once you stop expecting someone to deserve your trust. Daniel never noticed. He was too busy planning his future with Brianna to notice that his entire present was already slipping out from under him. He had no idea that the woman cooking his dinner every night already owned the roof over his head. The company he was so proud of, and a folder full of proof that would soon make sure he lost everything he thought was safely his. I just needed the right moment, and I knew exactly where that moment would happen.